Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. These weekends, they're a kind of mixture of social and intellectual, aren't they? So I feel bad about interrupting your conversation, but I'm also delighted that so many of you are here for our next speaker, who is Dr. Tinashe Mushakavanhu. Tinashe has become a fantastic and highly valued member of the college and the senior common room. He has a fascinating background and range of interests. He was born in and his first degree was successfully completed in Zimbabwe. He then did a master's in Carmarthen in Wales, a doctorate at the University of Kent, and over time has had fellowships in Edinburgh, Johannesburg, New York, and we're delighted that he's now our junior research fellow in African and comparative literature. He's an editor, a curator, a writer, and I do encourage you, if you haven't opened the fantastic edition we have of The Ship this year, to, amongst the many other brilliant contributions, read Tinashe's piece in that. And today, I'm not going to explain his title, but what a fantastic title, Seeking the Cosmic Speakers. I'm delighted to ask you to welcome Tinashe to speak to us and then to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you to our principal, Helen King, for this wonderful and generous introduction. And thank you all for being in this room. It has been a great gift to be a member of St. Anne's College as a junior research fellow. Okay, so that's me when I was 18 years old. It has been a gift to be a member of St. Anne's College as a junior research fellow in African and comparative literature. Often I'm asked in coffee shops, on the streets, at high tables, in far-flung African cities such as Harare, Johannesburg, Kampala, Nairobi, everywhere, even New York. What is it I do in Oxford? My answer is always simple. I'm at Oxford to daydream. And my talk is about dreaming, taking flights of fancy. I wrote myself into the long history of Oxford without knowing it. Like many people around the world, Oxford was aspirational, an idea, a North Star we see shoot in the skyline of our dreams. My decision to study two writers, Dambudzo Marichera and Percy Shelley, was indirectly a study of Oxford. Here were two writers who were expelled from Oxford 165 years apart. One for writing a pamphlet about the necessity of atheism, and the other for allegedly trying to burn down his college. It is a fantastical story, an unlikely genealogy that had not been written about before. There was no better place to conduct this research than Oxford. There was no better place to conduct this research than Oxford, I thought. But after inquiring with the professor in the Faculty of English, looking for a supervisor, they discouraged me and from applying, and told me it was a hard sell, that I might not complete this degree at all, that my fate may end up like the two writers I was proposing to study. So unfortunately or fortunately, I had to go elsewhere to write and imagine Oxford from a distance. But here I am living and working in Oxford. It is a strange homecoming of sorts to live in a place I inhabited in my imagination for many years. In other words, my doctoral project connected two writers conventionally kept separate, the English Romantic poet Percy B. Shelley and the 20th century African writer Dambudzo Marichera. This comparative encounter was itself inspired by both authors' tendencies to seek out new and surprising interrelationships across national, linguistic, and cultural borders. At the core of my research practice is emphasis on writing not only as a tool for critical and creative thinking, but writing as thinking. I'm interested in questions of belonging, alliance building, translation, exchange, especially when the relations which texts represent do not quite fit established ways of viewing social spaces, such as nation, race, family. My research also shows how literature addresses questions that are an essential part of contemporary discussion around race, empire, populism, and immigration. In this talk, we are going to make a few stops at places that have shaped me. We're going to take pauses at moments and events that have shaken me. And finally, I'm going to tell you of my retirement plan from Oxford, as I'm 369 days from the end of my contract and 375 days from the end of my visa. I wish I could see my future beyond these numbers. So welcome to my grandmother's pink house, my grandmother's house, my father's mother. This two-roomed, semi-detached house has hosted our whole village, cousins, uncles, aunts, strangers. It has been a transit place to Harare's hopes and dreams. I grew up climbing the mango tree in the yard, playing hide and seek with my siblings and the neighborhood children. My grandmother has hosted many gatherings under that tree. My uncle's wedding, a funeral for another uncle who died of AIDS, the christening of a cousin child, many family dispute resolutions, parties and celebrations. But we also sat under that tree to watch the moon or embrace the warmth of the sun. That tree has witnessed generations live, party, wed, divorce, and die. House number 4596, Zororo, Highfield, Harare, Zimbabwe. This house was my first school, my first museum, and the first space I experienced as a little boy, a place where my grandmother has presided over with love and care, but also a meeting point, a performance space where we've danced, sung, laughed, ate, drank, cooked. This is where I started learning to read the world, to ask questions about myself, my family history, our society, our country's politics, the world. My father's birthplace was in a small remote district called Binga, bordering Zambia, a place so remote that until recently, it had no radio signal. Binga is a small fact registered on my father's birth certificate. That was a big mystery to me. So much so that one of my first journalism jobs, so much so that one of my first journalism jobs as a young adult was to go to Binga for a story about the first all-female fishing cooperative in Zimbabwe. In 2011, a local charity, Zubo Trust, used a grant from UN Women to build a fishing rig with a cylindrical metal base that allows it to float, a shed made of aluminum sheets and an exposed bulb fixed to some metal poles that hold back nets, which attracts the fish during the night when the nets are lowered under the water. This floating object was made so that it would be easy for the women to navigate the waters of the Zambezi River, one of the largest bodies of water in Africa. It rises in Zambia, then it curves snake-like on its 2,500 kilometers journey to the west through Angola, skimming Namibia and Botswana, then flowing south along the border between Zambia and Zimbabwe, before finally running eastward through Mozambique, heading for the ocean. Along the Zambezi's route to the Indian Ocean, where it feeds the man-made Lake Kariba, is Binga, the district where my father was born. After the trip, I visited my grandmother to ask her about the mystery of my father's birthplace. I asked my grandmother, what were you doing in Binga when our ancestral village of Chipinge is on the other side of the country, near Mozambique? She looked at me and smiled as if she had always expected this moment. My grandmother said, "Child, the place you know is not the place I remember. There was no Binga those years. It was all bush. We cut down the trees to make a road. Your grandfather built the police station, the hospital, the native administrator's office, everything in Binga. And then we left and moved to the next town and the next town." My grandmother's memories of a place that does not exist or never existed for me. My grandmother's geography of this place we now call Zimbabwe is very different from my own? Could the lands we inhabit be imagined? Could the places we imagine be unreal? In my early fiction writing career, this house was a character in my short stories, mostly because I wanted my grandmother, who has basic English skills, to see herself in my imagination. She may not understand the language, but she knows her house. She knows her address. Okay. So a lot of my work is influenced by my grandmother's history of mothering, of nurturing community. I deploy memory work in my practice as a writer, curator, researcher, scholar. Though books have been my means of formal education, in my research and curatorial practices, I explored books, and the manifestations tend to be multimodal. For me, the reading of books now manifests as events, performances, lectures, exhibitions, because I choose to read with others. The solitary experience of reading is alienating, especially for those of us whose way of being is experienced and expressed collectively. The idea is to experiment with language and form in ways that activate the five senses, because reading is a multi-sensory experience. And in all of this, and in all my work up to this point, my other constant interlocutor is the Zimbabwean writer Dambudzo Marichera, who, despite being an unreliable witness, challenges me to not trust myself or any system that diminishes our blind impulses, because it is through this distrust that new surprising work emerges. Dambudzo Marichera functions in this work as an interference archive. He's here, he's everywhere. Perhaps I should tell you a little bit more about Dambudzo Marichera and why you should know him. Marichera is an unlikely Oxford writer who is never represented in the survey displays at Blackwell's or Waterstones that celebrate writers such as Tolkien, Wall, Carroll, C.S. Lewis, Murdoch, and others. Marichera is a different kind of Oxford writer who insisted on his status as an insider, but who also reveled in being an outsider. Geography can help begin to map parts of these animated self-scapes and open up the tracings of the spatial remains that make us. It can help trace out the legacies of the past we carry through memory as we practice the present and enter the future. The oft-repeated story is that Dambudzo Marichera tried to burn down his college or the university library. It is one of the many fantastical myths about him. In his college file, there is mention of threats to start small fires, alarming statements he probably said to unsettle the college superiors. Marichera knew too well how to weaponize words. Fire is such a potent metaphor in his life story. It is the embers of his life story and the brilliant literature he published that were the glowing residue of a 2-month exhibition that disruptive dialogues that I staged at the Old Fire Station this summer between July and August. Marichera was a disruptor who made it his mission to make powerful institutions and individuals uncomfortable. He explains this process as some kind of literary shock treatment. He explained what literary shock treatment meant to him in the following words. I like to write the kind of thing which describes things people take for granted, because I think original thinking can only come when we have discarded the idea of taking anything for granted. In that sense, that is why, for instance, I usually attack people's ideas of morality, precisely because morality is one of the things taken for granted by the majority of citizens. That this is not done, that this is not permissible, this is impossible, that this is not done. I try to write in such a way that I short circuit, like in electricity. I short circuit people's traditions and morals, because once you have done that, only then can they start having original thoughts of their own, and in a sense stop thinking in an institutionalized way. Then if they stop thinking like that and they look in a mirror, they will see how beautiful they are. In the future, so next year will be 50 years since Marichal arrived in Oxford. So it will be half a century since he arrived at New College. And yeah, so my reading, so I obviously with a PhD, you're forced to focus on a single subject, on a limited number of writers. But it is through Marichera that my work has also been very expansive, and I've tried to read him away from himself. Thus, for example, in 2016, I started building a digital archive of books about Zimbabwe, published from the 1950s to the present. The platform called readingzimbabwe.com was built around the questions: how do we read a country? Who gets to tell or write a country's stories? How do we come to understand a place and its people? The idea was simple: an open access reading list, and if possible, a brick and mortar library. Despite the ubiquity of the internet promises, it is hard to locate Zimbabwe on the internet. Material about Zimbabwe is scattered online or does not exist. In many instances, a lot of old Zimbabwean texts have no information or descriptions on the internet, especially those written and published in the indigenous languages, such as Shona or Ndebele. One of the challenges for my work has been, how do we archive gaps, or how do we acknowledge the absence of texts? Many of these texts have long since been out of print and have become a rarity to find. The title or the name of the author becomes a precious clue to suggest its existence. Most books about Zimbabwe, especially by Black writers and intellectuals, are out of print, were published in exile, and never trickled back to the country. As these books have become rare and can only be acquired through an auction system, through online marketplaces such as Amazon and eBay, for the most part, prices for these books are extremely expensive. Purchasing of these books is like is a luck of the draw. No covers, torn in parts, autographed to past owners, discarded ex-library copies. So yeah, so I spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to cover these gaps. So I can easily fill this grid, for example, with book covers, with like the synopsis of the books. But I intentionally left the gaps because I was trying to figure out how to find a visual language to communicate these gaps that I've been encountering and also trying to cover. So my PhD didn't come easy. In 2011, 2012, when David Cameron and Theresa May came into power, they changed the immigration rules, which affected me, and I had to leave the United Kingdom without a degree that I was a few weeks away to complete. This naive African doctoral student returned home to join the unemployed ranks of his country. With the respectability of a PhD stripped away from me, I had no identity because my sense of being was tied to the high-achieving culture of the academy, of the new global world we inhabit. But a Zimbabwean black market economy does not give one any kind of reprieve. Either you join in the activities or you starve. It was a setback, of course, but also a moment for me to take stock of my education, to ask myself, what is the point? I went back to the street corners of my childhood, to my friends, the street philosophers, Bigi, Zuze, Solo, Mzaya, those who never leave, but interact with the world from the vantage point of the street corner of a Black African township. I knew then that my education was irrelevant to me or my community if it failed to connect with this organic intellectual community. Fred Morton and Stefano Hani, in their book, The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study, describes the sense of general antagonism, which arises in resistance to unjust policy. General antagonism, they further explain, is a sense of dispossession and possession by the dispossessed. I was not yet aware of this book, but it retrospectively captures the rupture that happened within this violent crime against humanity, to use government policy to discriminate or institute, xenophobia changed my life. I knew then that I needed to make and understand knowledge in a way that activates my humanity and the humanity of others. Okay. As someone who operates in three mediums, creative writing, journalism, and the academy, my work celebrates the creative mystery and unpredictable wonders of the imagination. I like the idea of the happy eruption of the unexpected. My work is an open invitation, especially to young Black children growing up in Africa, whose lives may seem hopeless, whose futures may seem bleak because of our selfish politicians. My work is an invitation to daydream and to dream with others. It is meditations to repair and restore parts of ourselves, rituals to build the past we want to inhabit, rituals to heal the present, rituals to transport to our future selves. In 2018, I visited Kampala, Uganda. So that's my mother. In 2018, I visited Kampala, Uganda, where I met an old friend whom I knew because our writing journeys began at the same time. She's a gifted writer who had won major international awards, such as the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the Cain Prize for African Writing. She had been invited for prestigious residencies in Europe and America. But at some point, despite her talent and accomplishments, she disappeared from public view and retreated into the background to become a private citizen of the world. When we met in Kampala, she invited me along with another two friends from Malawi to show us a project she was working on. It was a house. She was building a house. It was a big Kampala house on a hilltop facing the city. She called it the Blue Marble after one of her books. She asked me later as we sat in her flat that evening while eating dinner what I wanted to do with my life. I said, I've always wanted to build a library in my community in Zimbabwe. She said, how noble of you, but please build something for yourself first. These words weighed on me because some conversations follow us. This one did. A year later, I received a big check for my writings, and I went back home to Zimbabwe and purchased a piece of land. It was an important occasion for many other reasons. Because I often ask myself, where is home? What is home? So I first left Zimbabwe when I was 23, and I feel like I'm now just a visitor back. I just feel like I'm now a visitor to Zimbabwe. We just had an election in August. As a diasporian Zimbabwean, I've no voting rights, so we're not allowed to participate in the discourse around in our country. We are treated as we're treated as enemies of the current government or governments in Zimbabwe. So where am I? I received this big check, bought this piece of land, and because I often ask myself, what is home? Where is home? And I don't know anymore. The only house that has been fixed in my life has only been my grandmother's house. My parents have moved from place to place all my life. So I bought this piece of land to try and build a home, to try and root myself somewhere. But during this process, two other life-changing events happened. My father was diagnosed with diabetes, and then my mother was diagnosed with cancer. Here I was trying to build something, trying to root myself, but at the brink of losing a parent or parents. It was a reminder of our mortality, a reminder that time does not wait. I still vividly remember going with my parents around scouting for land. At the time when my mother was very ill, in severe pain, with the movement of with the movement of the car, a bump in the road or a turn, my mother would squeeze her eyes in pain. 5 years later, my mother's cancer is in remission, so she's still alive. So I'm grateful. My parents have been important in my work. They are my resident librarians who keep my books, my scrapbooks, my archives, all the material I accumulate and hoard in my attempts to understand the world. Even though the Bodleian is special, and I spend so many hours buried in all the material I can get in there, I've been surprised with how inadequate sometimes it is in my bid to read Africa from Oxford. The emphasis is less on the lived experience of the African, but rather on the observer, the interloper, the one who passes through. My parents, as librarians, collect newspapers, magazines, books, films, art, which I then process and interpret. So there's a way in which I read with my parents. I work with my parents. You know, I kind of recruited them into this role because they get all the material that I need. I tell them to meet people. I send them money to buy stuff I need. So if in 375 days after my Oxford retirement and my visa or right to stay expires, at least I have somewhere to begin from when I go back to Zimbabwe. I may not have a roof over my head, but at least I will have walls to rest my back on and look up in the sky and be grateful for being alive and continue to dream. So before I sit down, I will play you a small video of my past life when I was trying to build a media company, because yeah, storytelling is important to me. So I will just end my talk with this 2-minute video clip. The fifth or 16 of my advice, innovators allowed the fellowships that are with innovative projects. Let's support their powers young mission to build and optimize new service for Africa's smaller generation. The ambition is to do for African media what Acid and advice is done for America's media. 70% of the population in Africa is under the age of 35. It's a generation curious of the world and other cultures. Most of the media on the African continent is controlled by governments, and young people are tired of propaganda. The two main barriers affecting media growth in Africa are lack of electricity and internet access. In young nation, we overcome this. There's no reason why Africa, with all its stories, cultures, and experiences, cannot have media that understands and appreciates its own needs and temperaments. And that is what is at the core of young nation. It is the aspirations and ambitions of a young generation that is denied space to articulate themselves. But it has been a great place to develop young nation. I have had interactions with the design team, the marketing, the developers, and every week I would meet and sit and discuss the progress that I was making, the challenges I was facing, and the opportunities that I needed to look into. I arrived in New York with just the seed of an idea, but in the time I've been in America, the idea has been transformed into a solid business concept, informed by thorough research, human-centered design thinking, and of course, drinking endless cups of coffee and eating cereal bars. Why started as a startup that is managed to attract so much funding, and I hope in the future that's what young mission will evolve into. Thank you very much.
Tinashe, that was fascinating and I think beautiful as well. You can hear the author, the almost poetry in the way you speak, which I think is so eloquent. Tinashe very kindly agreed to take questions. So please let's open it up to the floor. Who would like to ask them? Please, we'll split them up into these so everyone can hear the question too. I just wondered if you do go back to Zimbabwe after your time here, will you be able to fulfill your ambitions there, or will there be too many barriers?
Should I answer one?
Yeah,
okay. I think every single time my visa is expired, I've had no choice but to go back to Zimbabwe, which means every single time I've had to reinvent myself. But it obviously gets to a point where it's tiring, and sort of there's no sense of continuity in what one is doing, because I think every time I've just been responding to what is happening in the country. So for example, at this moment, Zimbabwe doesn't have a currency. So the economy functions on the black market. That's how the Zimbabwean economy functions at the moment, which means even if so it's a difficult place. It's a place I've not lived in. It's a place I don't necessarily live in. So every time I've just have to adjust. But I love going back. You know, my stories, all the stories I work on, or at least the stories I've been invested in telling, in investigating, very Zimbabwean. So I'm very interested in the colonial history of Zimbabwe. I'm interested in the politics of Zimbabwe. So going back is also sometimes very good for the work, because I'm able to meet people. I'm able to observe the situation. I think the only thing I learned is that I can't speak when I'm there, because I can go to prison, which has happened in the past. But so it's, I think it also changes the language. I think that's also the beauty of it. Like when you're being harassed by the state security agents, you learn how to critique without using language that looks political for them. So I think the creative turn of my work, I think, also happened because of that. Because they now see me, when they look at like my body of work, they think it's playful, they think it's childish, but it's also very serious and critiquing the establishment, the status quo. So there's a way in which going home has been useful in my work.
Thank you, Tinashe, for that really personal and moving account. And one thing that you said that resonated with me was this idea of writing as thinking, which seems to me a very Oxford and a very St. Anne's thing to say. But I was wondering whether, as many of us here are in active book discussion groups, could you give us a short, perhaps 2 or 3 titles of African literature that you think we really ought to read? Probably Marachera is one of them, but what would you advise us if we wanted to dip our toes into African writing? What should we read?
I think I'll just give you a Zimbabwean list. I think yes, I will definitely be biased. I think Tsitsi Dangarembwa's Nervous Conditions, it's a classical African novel. It's one of the most important books of the 20th, one of Africa's best books of the 20th century. Yvonne Vera's Butterfly Burning. Yvonne Vera is like close to Marachera. The next writer, like I'm actually working on a book on Yvonne Vera called We Laugh Even When the Roof is Falling. She is very poetic. She was the first director of Black female director of the National Gallery of Zimbabwe. And all her books are amazing, but Butterfly Burning is, I think, incredible. It's a book about a century of Zimbabwean history. And very much from about women's experiences, women's history. So incredible. And then maybe contemporary writers, some of my friends like No Violet Bulawayo. She's just she's been shortlisted twice for the Booker Prize. Her 2 books, We Need New Names and Glory, are also fantastic. So I think these ones will be kind of intergenerational. We offer an intergenerational perspective of Zimbabwe.
say those names again?
Or should we get Tinashe to share it with Jason, and we could email it out to everyone afterwards. I know not everyone's got pens to write things down, if that's okay. Thank you. And will you mark their essays with that?
Yes.
That would be great. And David.
Yeah, thank you for that. One thing you said that really resonated with me as someone that kind of dreamt of going to Oxford after I visited on a summer school was that you lived here kind of in your imagination. And I was really interested to know, how does your experience of Oxford compare with the Oxford of your imagination?
David was saying Tinashe had imagined Oxford for a long time before he came to live here. So how is the real Oxford compared with that imagined, the Oxford you built in your imagination?
I think
You can be honest. I don't have too much for disagreement.
I think they will forever be separate. I think they have not collided. They are just like separate entities. But I think the tension between them has been very generative and productive for me in my writing, in my thinking about place, about space, about occupying space. Yeah, I've just like started writing a book about Oxford. So so I think those different Oxfords are going to like meet, and it's a book that was inspired by Marechera, but now it's a book about a motley crowd of African writers who've passed through Oxford in the last 100 years. So it's different Oxfords that I have encountered in reading books by these African writers, but then also the Oxford I've been imagining. And, you know, when I was talking about going to like Kampala, going to Harare, to Johannesburg, and meeting, every time I arrive and people learn that I'm from Oxford, they have their own versions of Oxford. So every day I'm confronted with different Oxfords that don't even exist. I mean, I'm coming from Oxford. Someone in Kampala would be so confident that their Oxford is the real Oxford. So yeah, so the book is going to be instead of, I think, very much inspired by my being in Oxford. And I think I now have the poetic license to write about Oxford without fear. So it's going to be called Oxford, Black Oxford, and named after one of Marechera's short stories of the same title.
Questions there. So who taught your grandma how to tell stories?
I don't know. I think I think she does tell stories by mothering. I think she is just being a mother to all of us, to my parents, to her grandchildren, great-grandchildren. But then I was always the child who was always asking questions. So I learned about the history of like Highfields, for example, where my grandmother lives. It used to be a rice field, like a plantation, if you like. And my grandmother remembers all these places before buildings were put there. But yeah, for me, I think it was always something. So for example, there's an area in that township called Kumadaka. So Kumadaka means it's a swampy area. So we just grew, that corner is always flooded. I never understood why it was always like that. And then there are houses everywhere. So essentially, these houses for these black laborers were built in a swampy area. And one day I'm just having a chat with my grandmother. And then she said, oh, the reason why it's always flooded is because we're not supposed to live here. Rice was grown here. And then I was like, what do you mean rice was grown here? And then, I think because I'm a writer, I'm also interested in those stories. I've been trying to find ways of writing them and also trying to trace them in archives. So years ago, I was sitting in a library at the New York Public Library, and I found maps, like landscape maps of some of these areas where my parents and my grandparents grew up. And I just texted my mom. I said, Mom, what number is your farm? And then she was like, Farm 13. And I said, oh, I'm looking at all these like maps, and I can see where the farm is, and I can see what happened, how they were divided. So I think, yeah, those stories are now, my grandmother's stories, my parents' stories are now meeting my own stories and my own, imagination.
Hi, thanks so much for your lecture. I was really struck by you speaking about how do you pronounce Maricheras? Sorry, just butchering that. The way in which he was a disruptor, the way in which he unsettled, New College, Oxford, while he was here. And then also you speaking about kind of this, how being like this, the high achievement of academia kind of gets into your identity. So yeah, I guess I'm just, and then I'm also quite interested in you speaking about, language, how your language changes when it's up against these kind of state forces, how it becomes more creative, what does it mean to kind of maybe disrupt some people's narratives of both Oxford and also Zimbabwe, like using narrative and storytelling, I guess. So the question is about how, especially in these spaces in which, a lot of people, including me, right, like have our identities bound up with some specific version of like, high achieving in academia, how we can still be disruptors, and maybe what the place of language and like storytelling could be in that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think for me, so when I first, how did I come to the UK? I started thinking of myself as a writer. So a Welsh poet came to Zimbabwe to run workshops, and she had been brought by the British Council. And yeah, where do I want to go with this? So she came to Zimbabwe, taught us these classes, and I had just started writing for newspapers. So there were many things happening at the time. Like I just wanted to be a writer. I was an undergraduate student at a university where I was not allowed to ask questions. Our head of department used to say that you should stop asking questions. You have to write notes that we give you. And so I was trying to find ways of expressing myself. And yeah, and then this poet came, and then I just written my first ever column in a national newspaper. And one of the most famous Zimbabwean writers came to this workshop and saw my name badge, and sort of grabbed me by the collar, and I was dangling. And then the Welsh poet, Mena Elfin, walked in and said, "What's going on?" And this man said, "Oh," so dropped me and said, "Oh, I disagree with this young man." And so we went back into the workshop, and then she said, and then she was struck by it. So she wanted to revisit that moment, and she said, "What was going on?" And so he explained that he disagreed with my views that I had written in a newspaper. But instead of writing a right of response or writing his own column in response so that there's a discourse, he just felt he had to use his physical power. And yeah, I think that's kind of like the very Zimbabwean, like I think the point is, as an 18-year-old, I was not allowed to imagine myself as a writer. I was not allowed to have a voice. I was not allowed to be expressive. I was just supposed to be a child who listens and just participates. And I think that translates like to the politics of Zimbabwe. And yeah, for me, that was my way out. That Welsh poet went back to Wales, and I sent an email to say thank you very much for just showing me different ways of being. And she wrote back and said, well, you should apply to do a master's in creative writing. And that's how I left Africa for the first time. And yeah, and that changed my life, changed my family's life. And yeah, so I think, yeah, now I know how I wanted to answer you. I think the point is connection. I think the activating one's networks, one's connection to elsewheres, I think for me is what has sustained me. This is how I've been able to survive in a place like Oxford, in a place like Canterbury, in a place like Carmarthen, because I have these elsewheres. And I can always run back to those elsewheres. There are people who are living parallel lives from my own, who challenge my privilege. You know, being in Oxford, I'm privileged. And sometimes when I'm talking to these young people living on the continent, the things I'm crying about are things that they are dreaming about. And so, yeah, so there's always, so I feel like activating these networks has sustained me and just helped me to look at a problem from different angles, perspectives.
Thank you. Hello. In an age of social media, how can a writer like yourself continue to ask questions and them not just be echoed round one small chamber? How can you get your voice heard wider?
I mean, I've become social media shy myself, so it's yeah. On one hand, I mean, I appreciate the democratizing gift that social media has given all of us, that we're able to speak, we're able to connect from different parts of the world. But I think that I've also been injured by the violence of social media. And yeah, so I think a part of me that is shy on social media is because of just the violence I've encountered. So when I went back to Zimbabwe in between my PhD, one of the things that I did to survive was to come up with like social media consultancy. On one hand, I used to feel guilty because I used to like approach like media companies and teach them how to use social media, how to use like Facebook, Twitter, and all of these things. Because I just, yeah. So I was always very interested. I think this is how I started building this project. Like this project was very much a social media driven digital startup. So that's how it started. I was very invested in it. I decided I was going to learn as much as I can. And this is how I ended up in New York. I didn't know anyone in New York. This video is, I don't know, 7-8 years old. Like this is my first time in New York. I didn't know anybody there. But I went there because of Twitter. I just saw a link and that's how I ended up there. But yeah, I think it's important. You know, I think I cannot disqualify the importance of social media. I just think that the politicians have also wisened up. So this is why we now also have a problem. And I think this is why I left this world temporarily, because I think I was now very disillusioned. And I felt that coming back into the academy, I can process information, I can try to ask questions, I can, without, kind of the difficulties of social media. But I mean, the one other thing that happened is that in that period where I adopt social media as a survival thing, I was hired by the oldest private newspaper in Zimbabwe. So I became the inaugural group digital editor the Financial Gazette. So my job was essentially to integrate the newsroom and think about online media and all of these things. So I care deeply. Like, the reason I wanted to show this is because ultimately I think I'm very much interested in a discourse that includes young people on the continent. And I'm trying to try to use my platform's privilege to activate opportunities for that to happen.
Yes, thank you for absolutely fascinating experiences you showed us. I wondered, as part of this discourse, do you find the English school at Oxford is receptive to teaching the students African literature, and what part does it play, if at all, in the current undergraduate syllabus?
I don't know, on a second. I mean, no, not really. You know, I think, I think being here helps the faculty, because I am invited to do tutorials. I'm invited to supervise students. I do all kinds of things. I think institutionally, there's more that needs to be done. And I think maybe it's happening slowly through having people like myself as part of the Oxford community. Right now I'm working on a project. So right now I'm working on an exhibition. So I don't know, like in Oxford, on Magdalen Street, there's an alley called Friars Entry. So I'm turning Friars Entry into a public library. So my exhibition is going to be like an installation in that alley, and the public library will just focus on African literature, African books. So I think in a sense I also have to take it away from the faculty. So the faculty is not serving me enough. It doesn't allow me to express myself fully, doesn't give me the opportunities I crave for. So I seek other platforms within Oxford to extend the conversation. So the idea of that public library is just to invite the whole city to ask those questions, like where is African literature being taught? Where are the African books? What is the curriculum in the English department look like? So that is the point of doing this like public installation, and invite as many people. I think, like I said, I love reading with others. So it will be an invitation to the city to think with me about that.
I'm really glad for that question, because I was going to ask you something similar about what Oxford's response has been to you. The other thing that was going through my mind really is what do your parents make of what you're doing? Clearly you've recruited them, they're your librarians now. I'm sure they're very, very proud. I think sometimes parents don't always understand what their kids are doing. And having seen, particularly heard a bit about your mother in particular, if she was here, what would she say about you and what you're doing?
I think they're proud. I'm happy that I've been able to do the things that I have achieved in their lifetime. They've seen me. It's been a bumpy road journey, but they have been there to witness it. In the beginning, they were very, especially my dad was always very skeptical, because he was always worried that he can't afford, So if I said I want to go and study abroad, my father would say, we can't afford it. We won't have money. And then my mother would always respond and say, let these children dream. At least dreaming is for free. So let him be. So there was always this tension between praxis and reality in our household. And I think that is shaped how I think about the kind of work and impact I want to have. Yeah, I mean, the college has been amazing, you know. I can say that because the principal is here. But I mean, yeah, St. Anne's has been amazing, partly because when I first arrived, I was asking questions like, you know, like the first thing I do in every city I've lived is I try to figure out what libraries do they have, what do they have? And I did that with St. Anne's College. And I have become very good friends with the librarians. And, you know, I think right now we are probably building the strongest African collection in this university because the librarians have been very receptive and willing to buy books that are not available, and I've just been recommending them. They are not necessarily part of a curriculum, but I know what books did for me. Walking into a library in Zimbabwe and encountering a book on the shelves. I think that was what changed my life. That is what enabled me to dream, because these books were available. And I know what it means for other people, hopefully here, that when they do research, their research will be challenged by these perspectives that will also be within the library system. So, yeah, so I mean, yeah, so I think it's also been identifying safe spaces in Oxford where people are more like generous and responsive. And then obviously there have been much tougher places, and rather than expend my energy there, I focus where ideas are received. And yeah.
Tinashe, it's been an absolute privilege to listen to you this afternoon. It's an honour to have you as part of St. Anne's. And that slogan, if you like, that call, let the children dream. Dreaming is free from your mum. God, wouldn't it be fantastic if that was part of our education system? Let the children dream. We've got some freshers arriving in 2 weeks. I'm sure they wouldn't want to be called children, but let's hope that they, as so many of us, have the opportunity to dream in this place. Let's hope that they do too. Tinashe, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much.